A thin hand presses flat against a wooden door, holding it shut against a wind that wants in. Outside, the world has turned to white. The cold has teeth. It searches every seam in the old logs, screams around the corners, claws at the eaves like a living thing that has done this before and meant to do it again. And then, beneath the roar, a fist, pounding, once, twice. A voice cracks open in the dark, stripped of everything proud. Please, please, let us in. On one side of that door, a fire and a roof a whole valley swore was the work of a madman. On the other, the very people who laughed at it, now begging to be saved by it. And a boy, alone, his fingers closing slow around the bolt, deciding. The first thing was the cold. Not the kind that settles politely on the skin, but the kind that reaches down into the bones and decides to stay there. A thin hand pressed flat against rough wood, holding a door shut against a wind that wanted in. The hinges shuddered. Snow hissed through the seams like something alive and hungry. And out in that white, roaring dark, a fist began to pound. Once, twice. A voice cracked open beneath the storm. Please, please, let us in. Fingers tightened on the bolt. Then the picture went dark. The way a held breath goes quiet, just before it breaks. 6 months before that night, a 17-year-old believed the world had no use for a single one of his days. His name was Caleb. He had grown up in a place built for children that no one came back for. Long hallways that echoed, rows of narrow beds, a smell of old soap and colder mornings. The breakfast was the same most days, gray and lukewarm, and he ate it without lifting his eyes, because lifting his eyes meant looking at the door, and the door, in all his small life, had rarely brought anyone for him. He had learned a quiet kind of arithmetic. Most children count their birthdays up. Caleb had learned to count his down. In a handful of months, he would turn 18. And 18 meant the gate swung the other way, out, into a world that had not asked for him and would not be argued with. He had made his peace with that, the way a person makes peace with weather. You stop fighting it. You just pull your collar a little higher and keep walking. So when a woman who worked there came down the row of beds before the others had stirred, he assumed it was some kind of trouble. It usually was. She did not say much. She set an envelope on the table in front of him and folded her hands over each other, slow, like she was steadying something inside herself. The handwriting on the front was a stranger's. Careful, old-fashioned. The letters leaned the way a person leans when they have written the same name 1,000 times and still take care to get it right. His name. Caleb looked at it a long moment without touching it. Then he asked the only thing that mattered. Who sent this? The woman's voice was soft. A man, she said. He passed not long ago. He left this for you. He almost smiled at that. Almost. People did not leave things for him. That was a rule of his world. Learned early and learned hard. Boys like him received what was handed down, what was outgrown, what was left over, not what was meant. But he opened it anyway, and the floor of everything shifted under him. The letter was from an attorney in a town the boy had never heard of, in a stretch of high country far from any city he knew. The words were plain and clean. A man had died. He had left behind a piece of land, a cabin he had built with his own hands, a few belongings, and a small amount of money that had clearly taken a long life to gather. And the man, the letter said, had been his grandfather. Caleb read that line 3 times. Grandfather. The word felt too big for his mouth. It was a word for other people, a word out of picture books and the stories other children told about Sunday dinners and porch swings. He had been told, as far back as memory reached, that there was no one, no mother somewhere to be found, no father waiting at the edge of some better life, no name standing behind his name, just a boy who had arrived from nowhere and would, in a few short months, walk back out into nowhere. And now a single sheet of paper was telling him that nowhere had a face. The woman watched him read. There was something in her eyes he had not seen there before. Not pity. He knew pity well, the way you know a draft in a doorway. This was heavier than that. He tried to find you, she said quietly. For a long time. He kept trying. Caleb lifted his head. If a man had tried to find him, then why, in 17 years, had no one ever come? The woman looked down at her folded hands, as if the answer were too large to fit in such a small room. Some things, she said, get caught in the spaces between rules, and nobody comes along to fix them. They just stay caught. He sat very still. Down the hall, the others were beginning to wake, the ordinary scrape and shuffle of an ordinary morning. And in the middle of all that ordinary sound, a boy sat holding a piece of paper that had quietly rewritten 17 years of his life. For all those years, he had carried a single, settled grief, the belief that he had been unwanted from the very start. And now, a different grief was rising up beneath it, sharper, stranger, the grief of learning that he had been wanted and had not been allowed to know it. The journey took the better part of a day, and then deeper into the night. He rode near the back of a long bus, a single bag at his feet that held just about everything he owned, which was not much at all. 2 shirts, both a size too small. A coat with a zipper that gave up halfway. A comb. And the letter, folded and unfolded so many times the crease had gone soft as cloth. He kept it pressed against his chest, like a small thing that might take wing and fly away if he loosened his grip. Outside the window, the land kept changing. Flat gave way to rolling. Rolling lifted itself into rising. The towns thinned out and pulled apart until they were only little clusters of light, swallowed quickly by the dark behind them. The air, when the doors hissed open at a late stop, smelled different than any air he could remember. Thinner, cleaner, like air that had not been breathed by very many people and did not much care to be. He pressed his forehead to the cold glass and watched the mountains stand themselves up against the last gray of the light. And he felt something he had no good name for. Not hope. He had learned to handle hope the way you handle a hot pan, carefully, with something between you and it, but something near to hope. A cousin of it, maybe. The town, when he finally reached it, was small enough to take in with one slow turn of the head. One street, cracked straight down the middle like dried clay in a riverbed. A diner with a sign that buzzed and flickered. A feed store. A church with a steeple that had been wanting paint for some years. A few trucks parked at lazy angles, as though their owners had stopped worrying about straight lines a long time back. It was the kind of place where the same faces passed the same windows, and remembered exactly who was missing from them, People looked at him, not unkindly, just the way people look at a thing that does not belong to the picture they already know. Above the barber shop, a single window glowed. A narrow staircase climbed beside it, and on a door at the top, gold letters, worn down to dull brass, gave the name of the attorney who had written him into this whole strange morning. The man behind the desk was older, with thinning hair and glasses that sat crooked, as if he had simply given up the fight to make them stay level. His office smelled of paper and pipe smoke and a long, worn-out patience. Books climbed the walls clear to the ceiling, their spines cracked from years of being pulled down and pushed back. He looked up when the boy came in, and something moved across his face. "You're younger than the picture I had in my head," he said. "Your grandfather spoke of you like you were still small. I think, in his mind, maybe you stayed small." Caleb stood in the doorway, unsure where to put his hands. He had practiced what he would say on the long ride up. Every word of it left him now. What came out instead was the truth. "He had never met me," he began, then caught the slip and started over, carefully. He had never met him. The words felt like a confession of some failure he could not name. "I didn't know he was real. Not until a few days ago." The attorney set his pen down. For a moment, he said nothing at all. He just looked at the boy, the way a man looks at the last page of a long story he has been carrying by himself. That, he said at last, was the great sorrow of his life. Then he reached into a drawer, and here came the first true turning, the first crack in everything the boy thought he knew about his own beginning. The attorney did not hand him a treasure. He handed him a thin stack of papers, soft at the edges, the corners curled with age. "These are copies," the man said. "The originals sit in a cabinet in a building far from here. A cabinet that doesn't get opened much." He let the boy look. They were requests, petitions, asking, again and again, for one same thing. And across page after page, stamped in hard official ink, came the same short word, like a door shut in a man's face, and shut again. "Denied. Denied." Caleb turned one page, then another, then another. The word repeated down the years like a heartbeat that kept getting refused. "Your grandfather," the attorney said slowly, "spent the better part of his last years trying to bring you home. He filled out what they put in front of him. He waited. They told him he was too old, too far from anything that mattered to them, too much alone to be trusted with a child." The boy's jaw tightened. "So the answer came back no," the man went on, and the old fellow wrote again. And the answer came back no, and he wrote again, year after year. It was a long argument with a wall, and the wall does not get tired. Caleb stared down at the pages in his hands. Somewhere inside the stack was a younger version of himself, a child being argued over in rooms he had never seen, by a man whose face he had never known, against people who would shrug and reach for a stamp and move on to the next folder before lunch. He had grown up believing that no one had ever reached for him, and the truth, it turned out, was almost harder to hold than the lie had been. Someone had reached, for years, and the reaching had been turned away at every door. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" he said. His voice came out smaller than he had meant it to. The attorney's answer was gentle, and in its plainness, it was almost unbearable. "Because telling you was nobody's job, son. The rules cared about the paperwork. They didn't keep a line for love. The drive out to the land was rough. The attorney's truck was older than the boy, and it complained on every grade, coughing and shuddering as the road climbed into the pines. The man patted the dash now and then, soft, the way you gentle an old dog through a thunderstorm. The road narrowed. The trees crowded close on both sides, dark and tall and watchful. Then, all at once, they pulled back. And there it was, a clearing, gone wild with the long grass of a season that had passed without anyone to walk it. A leaning mailbox out at the turn, the name on its side faded down to a pale ghost of itself. And there, in the middle of the wide meadow, a cabin. The logs had weathered to the soft gray of an old coin. The corners were notched together with a care a person could feel from clear across the field. Even now, even with the porch gone tired and the steps sunk low. The windows held a gray film of dust, and behind them, the pale shapes of curtains gone yellow with all the years. It was small. It was plain. But that was not the thing that made the boy stop walking. It was the roof. There was not one roof on that cabin. There were two, one built up above the other, with a gap between them wide enough to fit an arm. The outer one was steeper, made of rough planks laid one over the next like the scales of some slow, patient animal. The whole shape of it looked, for all the world, like a house wearing a second house up on its head. Caleb stood and stared. Beside him, the attorney let out a long breath. The sound of a man who had answered the same question more times than he cared to count. That, the man said, is what this whole valley has wondered about for longer than you have been alive. What is it? The boy asked. The attorney was quiet a moment. Trouble, he said at last, depending on who you ask. They were not alone in the meadow. A small knot of people had gathered near the tree line. Men and women in heavy coats, their breath rising white in the chill. They watched the truck roll in the way folks watch weather they have learned not to trust. And at the center of them stood a man built like a piece of the land itself, broad across the shoulders, heavy through the hands, a face cut deep with lines, and a pair of eyes that had clearly made their mind up about the boy long before the boy had finished climbing down out of the truck. So that's him, the big man said. His voice was low and rough, the sound of gravel turning over in a barrel. The orphan. The attorney stepped in between them, smooth and easy, the way a man steps between two creatures that have not yet decided about each other. Caleb, he said, this is Earl. He's been building houses in this valley a good long while, longer than most anybody. Earl looked the boy up and down. It was a look the boy knew. He had been measured like that more times than he could number, by grown-ups deciding whether he was worth the bother, by a world that had a habit of making its mind up fast, and rarely changing it. 17, Earl said, thin as a fence rail. He let the word hang in the cold air. And you mean to winter up here, by yourself. The boy felt the old reflex rise in him, the one that made him go quiet and small and disappear somewhere deep inside, where the looks could not reach. This time, he did not let it. He straightened his back instead. He lifted his chin and met the big man's eyes. He came to see what his grandfather left him, the boy said. That's all. Earl laughed. It was a hard sound, with nothing soft folded into it. The laugh of a man who had spent a long life being right, and had run clean out of patience for anyone who might suggest there could be another way. What he left you, Earl said, is a joke. He jerked his chin toward the cabin. Look at that roof. 2 where 1 would do fine. Twice the timber. Twice the weight. The old man stacked enough wood up there to flatten the whole place the first time the snow comes down with any meaning to it. He stepped closer, close enough that the boy could smell sawdust and the cold coffee on him. That fellow was the strangest soul this valley has held, Earl said, and that roof of his is the proof of it. Then his voice shifted, dropped low, turned almost reasonable. And somehow, that was the worst of it. I'll take it off your hands, he said. The land, right now, more than it's worth. More than a boy like you will ever drag out of this dirt with 2 thin arms. He named a number. It was a large number to a boy who an hour ago had owned a comb and 2 shirts that did not fit. Take it, Earl said. Go on back to wherever they keep boys like you. This country wasn't built for soft hands. The whole meadow had gone still. The others studied their boots, the trees, the middle distance. Anywhere at all but the boy standing alone before a strange cabin, being told out loud, in front of every one of them, exactly how little the world expected him to amount to. Caleb looked at the cabin, at the dust on the windows, at the porch, gone tired, at that strange double roof a dead man had built with his own 2 hands. A man who had spent his last years arguing with a wall, trying to bring a boy he had never met back home. Then he turned and looked Earl square in the face. No, the boy said. The word was quiet, but it carried across the meadow like a struck bell. Earl's eyes narrowed. What did you say? I said no. His voice did not shake, though something deep inside him did. This land is the one thing he ever gave me. I'm not selling it. Not to you. Not to anybody. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the big man's face darkened, the way a sky darkens when it has made up its mind to ruin a day. You'll regret that, he said softly. Winters up here don't forgive the foolish, and that crazy roof of his won't save you when the weather finally comes for what it's owed. He turned on his heel. The others turned with him, drifting back toward their trucks, glancing over their shoulders as they went, the way people do when they have just watched a thing they cannot quite find words for. The attorney let out a breath he seemed to have been holding the whole time. Well, he said, first afternoon, and you've already gone and made yourself an enemy. He almost smiled. Around here, that might be some kind of record. But the boy was not listening to that part. He was watching the big man's broad back as he crossed the meadow, and something snagged in him, a small sour note in the music of the moment. He turned to the attorney. That number, he said, the one he just offered. You told me it was more than the land is worth. The older man's almost smile faded clean away, and what he said next would sit in the boy's chest like a cold stone all through the long months ahead. It is, the attorney said, by a good deal. He paused, and his gaze moved out toward the tree line. Careful now. Your grandfather had an offer like that once before. Years back. He turned it down flat, no hesitation, and the morning after the funeral, before that good man was even properly settled in the ground, that same fellow was up these stairs in my office, asking again for more. Caleb frowned. Why would he want it so badly? It's just a meadow, a cabin, a roof folks make fun of. The attorney was quiet for a long moment. Then he said a thing the boy would carry around like a pebble in the corner of his coat pocket. "That," he said, "is the question, isn't it? A man like Earl built his whole life on being the one who knows, the one who's right. And your grandfather. Well," the man chose his next words slowly. "Maybe Earl wants this land." He looked at the boy. "Or maybe he wants the question this place keeps asking to finally stop being asked out loud." The boy did not understand. Not yet. But he understood that there was a thing beneath the thing, a reason underneath the reason, and that the big man with the heavy hands had not driven all the way up this rough road just to mock a thin boy in a meadow. He had come to make certain the boy got on the next bus and went home. The attorney did not stay long. He had papers, he said, and a long road back down before the light gave out. He pressed a ring of cold keys into the boy's hand and looked at him with something that sat close to worry. "You don't have to do this on your own," the man said. "There are folks down in town. Not every last one of them is Earl." But Caleb was already looking at the cabin. "You could come stay a few nights in town." The attorney tried. "Sleep on it. Think the whole thing through. There's no shame in—" "I'd like to see inside," the boy said. The man studied him for a moment. Then he nodded, slow. The way a person nods when he has done all the arguing another soul is going to let him do. He climbed back into the old truck and drove off down the rutted road, the engine coughing into the trees, the sound of it growing smaller and smaller until there was nothing left of it at all, just wind in the long grass, and a boy, and a cabin, and a roof the whole valley swore had been built by a man out of his mind. The key fit the lock like it had been waiting for him. Inside, the air was cool and still, and it smelled of wood smoke long gone cold, and dust, and something underneath all that he could not quite name, something that felt oddly like being expected. A stone fireplace took up most of one wall, the hearth blackened by years and years of fires. A table, worn smooth as riverstone, 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the far corner, with a quilt faded down to the color of weak tea, its pattern of interlocking stars still faintly there, if a person knew to look for it. And books. Everywhere a person looked. On the shelves, on the table, stacked beside the bed in leaning towers that threatened to topple. Journals, most of them, bound in leather and cloth and plain board, the pages thick and close, with a small, careful, leaning hand. Caleb stood in the middle of all of it and turned a slow circle. A whole life set down in ink. A whole life. And not one line of it had ever found its way to him. He set his bag down on the floor. He did not light a fire. Not yet. He just stood there, in the gray light coming dusty through the windows, in the home of a man who had spent years trying to claim him, and had run out of time just weeks before the boy ever learned his name. Outside, the wind moved through the meadow, bending the long grass low. The light began to go. And as it went, he noticed something he had missed before. High in the corner, where the wall met the ceiling, the underside of the inner roof showed plain and tight and beautifully made. He could see the joins, the care taken with each one, the hours and the hours and the hours. He could not see the second roof from in here, but he knew it was up there. hanging above him in the dark, that strange extra layer of wood and nail and pure stubbornness, floating over the cabin like a thing keeping watch through the night. A roof a whole town had laughed at. A roof a big man wanted gone badly enough to climb a lawyer's stairs the very morning after a funeral. Caleb lowered himself onto the edge of the narrow bed. He did not yet know what the roof was for. He did not know about the storm the old men down in the diner were already feeling in their knees and their wrists. He did not know about the long, hard winter bearing down out of the high country, or the night a desperate fist would beat on that door, begging for the very warmth he was sitting inside of now. He did not know that the answer to every cruel thing that had been said to him this day was already written in a small and careful hand in the books stacked around his feet. He knew only this much. For 17 years, he had believed he belonged to no one. And now he sat inside a house built by a man who had believed, against every wall the world had the nerve to put up, that the boy belonged to him. He looked at the cold hearth, at the leaning towers of journals, at the curtains gone yellow, and the quilt with its quiet stars, and the heavy door with its waiting bolt. And for the first time in a long, long while, he did not feel the gate swinging open the other way. He felt instead the strange and frightening thing he had taught himself to live without. He felt like he had walked into a place that had been holding a space all this time, just for him. Out in the meadow, the grass bent low to the ground. The first real cold of the season came sliding down off the high ridges, soft as a hand laid on a shoulder, and settled over the cabin and its two roofs, and the thin boy sitting alone inside. Somewhere far down in the valley, a big man sat in a warm house and stared into his own fire and did not sleep. And up in the clearing, in the gathering dark, Caleb reached out a hand, took up the nearest journal from the top of the stack, and opened it slowly to the very first page. The first journal opened like a door into a quiet room. The hand inside was the same careful, leaning hand from the envelope. Small, patient. The letters formed by someone who had learned to write a long time ago, in some plain place, and had taken the lesson to heart. He read by the last of the gray light, and then by the light of a single candle stub he found in a tin on the mantel. He had meant to read a page or two. He read until the candle guttered and the words began to swim. The journals were not a diary, not exactly. They were something stranger and finer than that. They were a record of how to build, how to last, how to stand against the cold when the cold meant to take everything you had. And on the very pages where the boy expected to find the ramblings of the strange old man the whole valley laughed at, he found measurements. The gap between the two roofs must hold steady, one page read. The still air trapped between them does the work of far thicker timber, and it weighs the cabin down with nothing at all. The outer roof catches the wind and turns it aside before it can reach in and steal the warmth. He looked up at the ceiling. He thought of Earl in the meadow, sneering at all that extra wood. Twice the timber, twice the weight. Enough to flatten the place. He turned another page. The pitch of the outer roof must be steep, the old hand had written. Steeper than what folks around here build. There is a reason for it, though they will not stop to ask. Snow slides off before it can gather into a weight that kills. A reason for it. Caleb sat very still in the candlelight. The whole valley had spent a long time calling the man who built this place a fool. And here, in plain ink, in a small and patient hand, was the work of someone who had thought about every single board. Not a madman, a craftsman. The kind the world is quick to laugh at, right up until the morning it needs him. The next day, he went up onto the roof. He had no skill in it. He knew that. A boy who had grown up between narrow beds and long hallways had not been handed a hammer and shown what to do with it. But the journal showed him, page by page. The old hand walked him through it, the way a patient teacher walks a slow student, where the boards had shrunk and left gaps for the weather to find, where a support post had shifted a finger's width over the years and needed coaxing back, where the two roofs spoke to each other through small, hidden joints, so that the whole thing moved together, like a living body, instead of fighting itself apart. His hands learned slowly. They blistered first, then bled a little, then hardened, and something in him steadied as they did. For the first time anyone had bothered to give him, he had a thing to do with his hands that mattered, a thing that someone, somewhere, had wanted him to know. He worked through the short, cold days and read through the long, cold nights. And the cabin, board by board, began to feel less like a dead man's house and more like a letter being read aloud, slowly, just for him. Then came the thing he did not go looking for. It happened on a gray afternoon, with the wind picking at the eaves. He had pried up a stretch of the inner roof boards, following a note in the journal about a joint that wanted checking before the deep cold set in. He set the boards aside, and underneath, on the broad face of one of the old beams, where no eye had been meant to see, there were marks, not the marks of a saw, not the scars of building, letters, carved careful and deep into the wood, by a hand the boy already knew. What was carved there would put a crack straight through the middle of him. He leaned close in the dim light, and he read what the beam said. For the boy, when he is grown enough to climb up here and find it. The breath went out of him. He brought the candle nearer, his hand not quite steady, and he saw that the first mark was not alone. Further along the beam, there was another, and another past that, spaced out the length of the old wood, the way mile markers space out along a long and lonely road. He read them one by one. The first was small and simple. The boy is small somewhere tonight. A man up here is thinking of him. The next said a little further on, the cuts a touch deeper, as though the carver had pressed harder that year. The boy is older now. A man wonders what his voice sounds like. And another, the boy is near grown. A man hopes someone has told him he is worth a great deal. The candle shook in his grip. All those years, a man had climbed up beneath this strange roof, alone, with a chisel and a steady hand, and he had marked the passing of a child he had never been allowed to hold. He had no photographs to keep. He had no birthdays to attend. So he had done the one thing a builder knows how to do. He had carved the boy into the bones of the house, year after year, quiet, hidden, where the weather could not reach it, and where, one far-off day, a grown boy might climb up and find that he had been kept. Caleb pressed his hand flat against the carved wood. The grain was cool under his palm. The letters were rough at the edges where the chisel had bitten, and the boy, who had taught himself a long time ago not to cry where anyone might see, found that up here, in the dark between two roofs, with no one in the world to watch him. There was no one left to hide it from. He stayed up there a long while. When he came back down, the cabin was the same as it had been. But he was not. He understood now, in a way no letter and no lawyer could have made him understand, that he had been somebody's whole reason, that somewhere out in the long cold of all those years he could not remember, a man had been carrying him, not the way you carry a memory, the way you carry a hope. The journals, after that, read differently. He went back to the beginning and read them slowly. And now he could hear the man's voice underneath the measurements, the way a person hears music underneath the words of a hymn. He learned where the knowledge came from. It had not begun with the old man at all. It went back and further back to people who had lived in high, hard places across the water where the winters did not bargain. People who had learned to build a roof that breathed, who had passed the knowing down, hand to hand, the way other families pass down a name or a Bible or a piece of land. The old man had been a keeper of that knowing. He had kept it when others let it go. He had tested it and trusted it and set it down in these books so it would last past him. And he had built this cabin, the boy understood now, as the truest thing he had to give, a shelter. For a child, the world kept handing back. But the journals held a darker page, too. Caleb came on it without warning, the way you come on a cold patch in a warm river. It was set down in a year he did the arithmetic on, and his stomach turned over. It was the year his own father had walked away. The hand was steady, but the words underneath it were not. The man's son was gone, the page said. He took the money, the savings of 20 hard years, hidden in a tin above the stove. He took the last of it and left behind a few words, and the words were these: "You and your crazy roof can rot up here. There is no coming back." The boy lowered the book. His own father, the shadow behind the shadow, a man he had no memory of, no picture of, no single solid thing to hold. And here he was at last, and this was who he turned out to be. A son who had robbed his own father, a son who had called him crazy, and meant it, and walked off down the mountain with the old man's life savings in his pocket. He made himself read on, and what he found turned the knife, and then, somehow, drew it out again. "A man cannot make his son love him," the old hand had written. He tried. He failed. He blames himself more than the boy. He was so busy with his building, his measuring, his roof, that he forgot to build the one thing that mattered. He forgot to build a way into his own son's heart. He turned the page, dreading it, and found, instead of bitterness, a vow. "If a man is ever given a second chance," the page read, "he will not make the same mistake twice. If he ever finds the child, he will love him first. He will teach him second. He will let the boy know every single day that he is wanted, whatever it costs, whatever walls they put up." Caleb read it 3 times. A man who had been robbed by his own son. A man who had been called crazy by the person he had loved the longest. And still, he had turned around and spent his last years trying to reach a grandson he had never met. Still, he had carved that grandson into the rafters. Still, he had built him a shelter and left him a way to live. The forgiveness in those few plain lines was almost too heavy for the boy to hold. He sat with the book open on his knees, the fire low, the wind working at the seams of the cabin, and he made a quiet promise to a man he would never get to meet. He would learn it, all of it. He would keep the knowing the way the old man had kept it. He would not let the laughter of a valley turn a good man into a joke, not while there was breath in him to say otherwise. But promises do not fill a stomach. And the cold, plain truth of it was this: the small money the old man had left was going fast. Nails cost, boards cost, the few tools the boy could not find in the cabin cost, and a body working from first light to last, up on a roof in the cold, eats more than a body sitting still. So he walked down to town, to the feed store, with what was left folded thin in his pocket. The bell over the door gave its little jangle as he stepped in, and the talk inside stopped. Not all at once. It frayed, the way talk frays when a room turns its attention somewhere it would rather not say out loud. A man near the stove went quiet. A woman by the shelves found something on a high shelf to study. He felt every eye find him, and then carefully not find him. He had grown up under looks like these. He knew their weight to the ounce. He brought what he needed to the counter and set it down. Nails, a few feet of board, a little food to stretch across the days. The man behind the counter looked at the small pile. Then he looked at the boy. "We're short on most of that," the man said. Caleb looked at the shelves behind him, where the same goods sat in plain view. The man followed his eyes and did not change his answer. "Short," he said again. Flatter this time. And the boy understood. It was not the shelves that were short. It was the welcome. Word had gone around. A big man with heavy hands had a long reach in a small place, and the reach had gotten here first. The thin boy from nowhere, with his dead grandfather's crazy roof and his stubborn no. He was not to be helped. Let the winter do what the offer could not. The man would sell him a little, in the end, just enough to make the refusal look like something other than what it was. But what little there was to be had, the boy could not have all of. Not the boards and the food both. Not on the few coins left folded in his pocket. The town had left him a choice. And the choice was a cruel one. He did not argue. Arguing was a thing he had given up a long time ago, the way you give up on a door that has stayed locked too long. He took the little the man would sell him. He paid. He walked back out under the jangling bell, into the cold street, where the same trucks sat at their same lazy angles, and the same faces watched him from behind the same windows. And he climbed the long road back up to the meadow with a hollow place under his ribs that had nothing to do with hunger. That night, the choice sat down across from him like a hard companion. The roof needed boards before the deep cold came. The journals were plain about that. A gap left open was a gap the weather would find, and a roof half ready was a roof that could fail when it counted. But boards cost what little food money he had, and a boy cannot work a roof on an empty stomach for long. He sat at the worn table with the small pile of coins in front of him, and the journals stacked around him, and the carved beams overhead in the dark, and he turned the choice over and over. Eat now, and let the roof wait, and pray the cold held off. Or feed the roof, and go hungry, and trust the old man's work to feed him later, when the weather came for what it was owed. It was not a fair thing to ask of anyone. It was a far harder thing to ask of a boy who had spent his whole life being handed the short end of every choice. He looked up at the dark beams. He thought of a man climbing up there alone, year after year, carving a child he was not allowed to keep, and he made his choice the way the old man would have made it. He chose the roof. He set aside the board money. He set aside the nail money. And he kept back only enough to keep himself going, thin as a fence rail, the way the big man had said. It was not a choice that made the night warmer, but it was a choice he could live inside of. Some mornings later, Caleb came out onto the sagging porch and found something there that had not been there the night before. A dish, covered with a cloth, set down careful on the top step where the wind would not reach it. He looked out across the meadow. The grass was stiff with frost. The tree line stood dark and still. There was no truck, no tracks he could read. Whoever had come quiet, and gone quiet, and meant for it to be that way. He carried the dish inside. Under the cloth was food, real food. Warm not long ago, the kind a person makes in a real kitchen for someone they have decided to feed. There was no note. He ate it slowly at the worn table, and for a little while the hollow place under his ribs was not so hollow. The dish came again, and again, every few days, set down on that same top step in the gray before the boy was up. He took to leaving the empty dish out, washed clean, and in the morning it would be gone. And some days, a full one had taken its place. He did not catch whoever left it. For a long stretch, he did not know. And then one cold afternoon, down at the edge of town, on his way back from a hard errand, he came face to face with a woman he had seen once before, in the meadow, standing at the edge of the crowd that had watched him refuse the big man's money. She was older, kind-eyed. Worry had drawn fine lines at the corners of her mouth. The kind worry draws when a person has spent years standing close to someone hard. She had a way of looking at the boy that he was not used to, like he was a person, not a problem. She did not waste words. "He isn't cruel," she said quietly. "My husband. Folks think it, but it isn't so." The boy said nothing. He was not sure what a person was meant to say to that. "He's afraid," the woman went on. Her voice was low, almost as if she were saying it as much to herself as to him. "He spent his whole life being the man who knows best, the man who builds it right, and your grandfather." Her eyes moved up the road, toward the mountains, toward the meadow the boy could not see from here. "Your grandfather built it a different way, and if that different way turns out to hold, then a lot of years go quiet inside a proud man. A lot of houses start to look like the wrong houses." He understood her then. He understood that the dish on the step had come from her hands, and he understood, too, what it had cost her to set it there. "That doesn't mean a boy should go hungry," she said simply, and that was the whole of her meaning. Whatever the men decide between them, she did not stay to be thanked. She turned and went back up the cold street toward the warm house and the proud, frightened man inside it, and left the boy standing there with a small, unfamiliar warmth somewhere behind his ribs. It was not friendship, not yet. It was something quieter than that. It was the first hand the valley had reached out to him, and it had come, of all places, from the house of the man who wanted him gone. The deep cold came on, and with it came the old men. Caleb heard them before he understood them. Low talk around the stove in the diner, when he stopped in out of the wind for the price of a cup of coffee he made last an hour. Talk of the pressure being wrong, of the birds going early, of the squirrels working at their stores like something was bearing down on them that they alone could feel. One of them watched the boy over the rim of his cup. He was old, this one, older than the rest. His hands were knotted with the years, but they moved sure and steady around a small piece of wood and a worn knife, the way hands move when they have done a thing 10,000 times. He waited until the others had drifted off. Then he spoke to the boy direct for the first time. "You're up at the old place," he said. It was not a question. The boy nodded. The old man's knife went still. "Felt a winter like the one that's coming once before," he said. "A long time back, when these hands were young. The sky did just what it's doing now. The birds, the pressure, all of it." His eyes, pale and far off, found the boy's. "Then it came down," he said. "The killing one. Came without much warning. Got so cold, a man's breath turned to glass. Got so the snow came sideways, thick enough that a body couldn't see a hand held out in front of his own face. The boy had gone still. Folks lost roofs that winter," the old man said. "Lost more than roofs. Houses built the right way, the proper way, the way everybody knew was right. They folded up like paper under a weight they were never asked to carry." "How did you live through it?" the boy asked. The old man pulled back his sleeve. A long, pale scar ran the length of his forearm, from wrist to elbow. "Got this trying to hold a beam up that didn't want holding," he said. "It came down anyway. They mostly do." He let the sleeve fall. A man and his wife went out into that storm in their nightclothes, with no place left to go. They would have died out there in the white, the both of them. He set down his knife, and the boy leaned in, because he already knew, somehow, what was coming. "One place held that winter," the old man said. "One. While the proper houses folded all up and down this valley, there was a cabin up in a high meadow that didn't so much as groan. Took in everybody it could fit. Kept them alive around its fire while the cold tried its level best to get in." His pale eyes held the boy's. "Your grandfather's place," he said. "That crazy roof everybody laughs at. It's the reason these old bones are still walking around. He never once said he told us so. He just handed out coffee and blankets and treated a half-frozen stranger like kin." The boy could barely breathe. "Then why," he asked, "do they still call him crazy?" The old man's face went hard, and a little sad. "Because folks don't take kindly to being saved by the man they made fun of," he said. "That cabin standing was like a mirror held up to the whole valley. Showed every last one of them their own foolishness. And there is little a proud man hates more than a mirror." He picked his knife back up. He turned the small piece of wood in his gnarled hands. And then he said the thing the boy would carry up the mountain with him into the cold dark and hold close all through the hard nights to come. "The weather's got that same feel to it now, son," the old man said. "Same as before the killing one. So you stock what you can, you feed that fire, and you pray the work you've been doing up there is every bit as good as the old man believed it was." He looked the boy over, head to foot, this thin, stubborn boy from nowhere who had told a powerful man no. "For what it's worth," he added, quieter, "I think it just might be." Caleb walked back up the long road in the falling dark. The cold had teeth in it now, the kind that means business. The wind came down off the high ridges and searched him through his thin coat and found him. And he pulled his collar higher and kept walking the way he had learned to do. But something had changed in him over these short, hard weeks. He had come up this mountain believing he belonged to no one. He climbed it now, knowing better. He had a man's voice in his head, set down in a patient hand. He had a name carved into the rafters of a house. He had the knowing of people who had lasted through worse than this, handed down to him at last, through wood and ink and a chisel held by a man he would never meet. And down in the valley, in the warm house of his enemy, there was a kind-eyed woman who had decided a boy should not go hungry. It was not much, set against a whole town's cold shoulder, but it was more than he had carried up the mountain the first time. The cabin came into view across the frosted meadow, dark against the last gray light. 2 roofs, one above the other, waiting. He climbed the sagging steps. He let himself in and lit the fire, and the warmth came up around him the way it had every night since he came. And high above him in the dark, between the 2 roofs, the carved words kept their quiet watch over a boy who was, at long last, no longer quite so alone. Outside, far off, the first true snow of the season began to fall. Soft at first, the way the worst things often start. By the time the boy woke, the meadow had gone. The snow had come down in the night, quiet and patient, and laid a white hush over the whole of the high country, fence and woodpile, and the hard edges of the world, all of it gentled away beneath the same soft weight. It pressed down on a person's ears and made them listen for something they could not name. It was not the killing kind, not yet. It was the kind that asks a question, and all up and down the valley, in the days that followed, the question got its answer. Caleb did not learn it from any notice or any report. He learned it the way folks in a small place learn everything, slowly and sideways, and by the look that settles on people's faces when a thing they trusted starts to come apart. A family down the road lost half a shed when one side of it sagged under the white weight and folded. A roof in town opened a seam along its spine, and the cold water came through it steady into the rooms below, ruining what it touched. A man spent the better part of 3 days up a ladder against that roof, patching and cursing at a sky that paid him no mind at all. The big man with the heavy hands spent those same days up on his own roof, bracing, patching, working hard, in plain view of a town that had always trusted his hands without a moment's doubt. And up in the high meadow, the old cabin simply stood. Not a leak, not a groan, not one board out of its place. The outer roof caught the snow and shed it down its steep face before it could gather into a weight that mattered. What little stayed sat up there, held apart from the warm rooms below by that band of still air the whole valley had spent so long laughing at. Caleb went out onto the porch one cold morning with a tin cup of coffee warming his hands. He stood there in the white quiet, and he watched his own breath rise and vanish. A truck slowed on the road below the meadow. The big man was at the wheel. He looked up the long slope at the boy, at the cabin behind him, at the 2 gray roofs, calm and unbothered above a thin boy drinking coffee as though he had every right to the morning. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then the truck pulled away. The big man did not call out. He did not sneer through the glass. He just drove on, slow, the way a man drives when a thing has begun to gnaw at him that he cannot yet put into words. And the boy understood, watching that truck shrink down the white road, that the question the small snow had asked was a question the whole valley had begun, at last, to hear. The old man from the diner found him a few days after. Caleb had gone down for the price of a coffee and the warmth of the stove, and the old man eased himself into the chair across the little table, his knees cracking like dry kindling. It held, the old man said, the little one. The boy nodded. But the little one was just clearing its throat, son, the old man said, just stretching its legs. He turned his head toward the window, toward the white country beyond the glass. The big one's still out there, still gathering itself. He laid a knotted hand flat on the table, as if he could feel it through the wood. I feel it the way a body feels something standing behind it in a dark room. He leaned in. I've told them, he said. Anyone who'd hold still long enough to hear. Told them to lay in wood. Told them to lay in food and keep their children close. The big man called me a senile old fool to my face, in front of the whole diner. He shook his head, slow and sad. Folks would sooner trust a proud man than a frightened one, even when the frightened one has the truth on his side. The boy looked down into his cup. What should a person do, he asked, when the worst of it comes? The old man was quiet a while. His pale eyes drifted somewhere far off, somewhere a long way back. You keep your fire fed, he said at last. You keep your door shut tight, and when it comes knocking on it, and it will come knocking. He stopped. His hands went still. You think hard about what the old man would have done. The boy looked up. What would he have done? He asked. The old man's face softened into something between grief and wonder. He'd have opened it, the old man said, every time. To anybody at all, even the ones who'd stood in his own meadow and laughed in his face. He'd have opened that door and handed them a hot cup and a blanket off his own bed, and he wouldn't have breathed one single word about who turned out to be right. He pushed himself up, slow, and laid his gnarled hand on the boy's shoulder. That's the part they could never make sense of about him, the old man said. That's the part that frightened them most of all. A man who could be right and not need you to know it. He squeezed once. There's not many of those. You hold on to whatever he taught you, son. Caleb carried those words back up the mountain, and he finished his work. He went over every joint the journals named, by name, in order, the way a person says a prayer they have learned by heart. He checked the band of still air between the two roofs along its whole length, board by patient board, in the last of each short day's light. He split wood until his hands ached and the pile rose high against the cabin wall, dark and solid as a second house. He laid in what little food the town would let him buy, and what the kind-eyed woman left, still, on his step, in the gray before the dawn. He did the work the way the old man had done it. Careful, slow, as though someone he loved depended on every single nail. And then there was nothing left to do but wait. And the waiting was the hardest part of all. The sky changed first. It went the color of old iron, low and heavy, until it seemed to settle right down onto the shoulders of the mountains and make them stoop beneath it. The air went still in a way that was worse than any wind could have been. The birds that had been scolding in the pines fell silent, all at once, as if some signal had passed among them that the boy could not hear. The whole valley seemed to draw one long breath and hold it. Caleb stood on the porch and watched it come. He could feel it now, the thing the old man had carried in his bones. A great weight gathering at the top of the world. A patience with no mercy folded anywhere inside it. The first flakes fell at the ragged edge of the afternoon. They did not come soft this time. They came slanted and hard, driven on the front edge of a wind that had been building somewhere far beyond the ridges and arrived all at once, the way grief arrives, with everything it owns. By the time the light failed, he could no longer make out the tree line. By the time the cold settled in earnest, he could no longer see his own woodpile, a few short steps from his own door. The whole world had narrowed down to the four walls of the cabin and the white roar beyond them. And inside those walls, the fire burned. He fed it, and tended it, and listened. The wind threw itself at the cabin the way a thing throws itself at a door it means to break down. It found every seam in the old logs. It searched every joint. It screamed around the corners and clawed at the eaves and trusted with all the patience of something that had done this work before and meant to do it again, to get inside. But the cabin held. The walls did not shake. The ceiling did not groan or shift. High overhead, in the dark band between the two roofs, the carved words kept their quiet watch, and the still air did its silent, ancient work, and the steep outer roof turned the snow aside before it could ever gather into the weight that kills. Inside, the warmth stayed. Caleb sat by the fire with a journal open and unread on his knees, and he was afraid, and he was alone, and he was, against every cold promise the valley had made him, safe. He could not have said how long the storm went on. Time came undone in a place like that. There was only the fire and the roar and the slow rhythm of feeding the one while outlasting the other. He slept in pieces, sitting up, the way a person sleeps when sleeping all the way down feels like a thing too dangerous to allow. And somewhere in the deep heart of it, the sounds began. The first came from far off, carried thin and broken on the wind. A crack, sharp and final, like something enormous breaking that was never built to break. Then another. Then a long, low groan that seemed to travel up through the frozen ground itself, into the soles of the boy's feet, into the very marrow of him. He knew what it was. He did not want to know, but he knew. Out there in the white, the proper houses were beginning to fail. The roofs built the right way, the proper way, the way the whole valley had trusted without ever once stopping to ask why, were folding now under a weight they had not been made to carry. He stood by the door and listened to a valley come apart in the dark, and there was nothing in the world he could do about it. A person cannot walk out into a thing like that. To open the door was to lose the warmth in a breath. To step off the porch was to lose the cabin in 3 strides, and lose the rest of everything not long after. So he stood there, helpless, with the carved names overhead and the fire warm at his back, and he waited, and he prayed in the wordless way that frightened people pray. And then, near the lowest and darkest hour of the night, it came. This was the moment the whole long story had been bending toward, from its very first breath. A sound beneath the roar of the wind, a fist against the door. Caleb went still all over. For a moment he thought the storm itself had made it, that the wind had hurled something against the wood, that a sound so longed for and so dreaded, both at once, could not be a real thing in a real world. Then it came again, harder, frantic, and under it, a voice, cracked wide open and stripped clean of everything proud that had ever lived in it. Please, please, let us in. He crossed the room. He laid his hand flat against the rough wood of the door, just the way a boy had laid it there in the very first moment of this whole long tale, before a single soul knew the why of it. His fingers found the cold iron of the bolt, and on the other side of that door stood the man who had called his grandfather a fool to the whole valley. The man who had tried to buy this land out from under a boy who had nothing. The man who had set a town against him and emptied its shelves to him and told him to his face that this country was not built for soft hands. He could have left the door shut. A part of him wanted to. The old, hard part. The part the long hallways and the narrow beds had built in him. The part that had learned to expect the worst and shut the door before the worst could shut it first. But high overhead, in the dark, a careful hand had left its instruction in the bones of the house. Love him first. Open it. Every time. To anybody. Even the ones who laughed. He drew back the bolt. The wind tore the door clean out of his grip and threw it wide, and the cold poured in like a living thing with teeth. And there, on the porch, frosted white to the eyebrows, swaying on his own feet, stood the big man, and in his arms, wrapped in whatever he had been able to snatch up as his world came down around him, he held a small child. Behind him, half sunk in the snow, one hand fisted in his coat, stood the kind-eyed woman. The big man's eyes found the boy's. For one terrible, weightless moment, neither of them spoke. A whole winter of cruelty stood in the doorway between them. Every sneer, every shut door in town, every cold word the big man had ever set down on a thin boy from nowhere. Caleb looked at the man who had wanted him gone from this valley, and he said the only thing that was worth the saying. Get in by the fire. He did not say it cold. He did not say it to wound, though a wound would have been his to give. He stepped back, and he held the heavy door against the screaming wind, and he let them in. The big man stumbled across the threshold, and the woman came after, and the boy threw his whole thin shoulder against the door and forced it shut against the storm. The bolt slid home, and the roar fell away to a muffled, distant scream beyond the walls. The warmth closed over the three of them. He watched the woman's eyes go wide as she felt it, the difference of it. Out there, a cold that meant to kill them all. In here, a fire and a roof that held, and a thin boy who had opened his door to the very people who had bolted theirs against him. Steam rose off their frozen coats, and the big man, the proud man, the man built like a piece of the land itself, stood in the middle of a dead fool's cabin, and could not find one single word to say. They were not the last. Through the long hours of that night, more came. Caleb could not say afterward how any of them found the cabin in all that white. Maybe they followed the one light in the valley that had not gone dark. Maybe they followed the memory of an old man's kindness, told and retold around enough stoves over enough years that even those who laughed had let it sink in somewhere they did not admit to. But they came. A family with 3 small children, their own roof open to the sky above their beds. An older man who had spent his life measuring and marking the land, and his quiet wife. a young woman heavy with a child not yet born, and her husband, gray to the lips with fear. The old man from the diner, leading a small string of half-frozen souls, who had huddled together in one house until that house, too, gave way. By the deepest part of the night, the small cabin held far more people than any hand had ever meant it to hold. People who had mocked the man who built it, people who had called him crazy and laughed at his roof and let a thin boy go hungry sooner than cross a powerful one among them. People whose very lives now hung on the one thing they had spent so long spitting upon. He did what the old man would have done. He had no beds to give them. He had little food, but he had a fire and a roof that held, and the slow, sure knowing of how to make a small, warm space hold far more than it seemed it could. He put the children nearest the flames. He set the grown ones to taking turns at the wall and the floor and the few worn chairs. He melted snow in a pot for water. He stretched the little food across many hands until there was a mouthful for every soul in the room. And the big man, without being asked even once, rose up and worked beside him, hauling, feeding the fire, doing whatever the boy set down with no more than a look, in a silence that carried more than any apology ever could. The cabin held them all. The storm screamed for them all, and the carved names overhead kept watch over them all, the laughers and the laughed at, with no difference at all between them now. The cold makes no such distinctions. It comes for the proud and the gentle the same, and only the roof a fool had built stood between any of them and it. But the night was not finished with its testing. It began with the child, the small one the big man had carried through the white, a little thing, too young to understand what had so nearly happened to it, who had gone quiet in a corner near the hearth. Too quiet. The woman noticed first. A mother's instinct, or a grandmother's, the kind that wakes before the mind does. She knelt by the child and laid the back of her hand to its cheek, and her whole face changed in a way that pulled every eye in the crowded room toward her. The little one had gone cold. The kind of cold that the fire alone would not turn back now. The kind that settles down deep when a small body has been too long out in a thing far too big for it. The child's lips had paled. Its small hands hung loose and open. And the warmth of the room, for the first time that night, was not enough. The big man crossed the floor in 2 strides and dropped to his knees. And the hard, proud face split all the way open, and what lay underneath it was a terror as old as parents themselves. "Do something," he said, to no one, to everyone, to the storm beyond the walls. Somebody do something. But there was no one to do anything, no way out into the white, no help to send for, and no one to send. Just a crowded cabin and a fire that was not enough, and a small life beginning, very quietly, to drift toward the cold. And then the kind-eyed woman stood up. Something moved across her face, something old and long buried, and set aside a great while ago. "Lay the child here," she said. Her voice had changed. The softness was in it still, but underneath the softness now there was iron. The big man stared up at her. She was his wife. He had stood beside her through a long marriage, in a small house, in a small and quiet life. And he looked at her now as though some stranger had spoken, using her mouth. "You," he began. There was a thing she had once known how to do, she said, to him, to all of them, and her hands were already moving as she spoke. A thing she had learned a long time before this valley, before him, before the small, quiet life she had folded herself down into, year by year, to keep the peace beneath a proud man's roof. She had laid that knowing down after a sorrow of her own, a loss she did not name, and did not need to. The room could read it plain enough in the steadiness that had come over her. She had buried the knowing the way a person buries a thing too heavy to keep carrying through an ordinary day. But buried is not gone. And the knowing rose up in her now, sure and calm, the very way the old man's craft had risen up in the boy's blistered hands, on the roof, in the cold. She gathered the small cold child against her. She worked with a quiet that filled the whole crowded room, slow, certain, warming the little body the careful way, the patient way, the right way, the way that fear does not allow but knowing does. And the whole time, she spoke low to the child, a steady stream of soft words, the way a person talks a frightened, far-off thing back toward the warm. The cabin had gone silent. Every soul in it watched the kind-eyed woman work, her hands moving with a grace that not one of them had ever guessed lived inside her, drawing a small life back, breath by breath, from the cold edge it had wandered out toward. The big man knelt beside her, useless, a mountain of a man brought all the way down to the floor. And Caleb stood back, by the bolted door, and watched. He watched the woman who had left food on his step in the dark, and asked nothing for it. The woman married to the man who had wanted him gone. The woman who had folded a great gift down into silence for years, so as not to trouble a proud man's pride. He watched her bring the child back. It came slow, a flutter first of the small pale eyelids, then a thin sound, hardly a sound at all, then a stirring and a weak cry that gathered strength and color creeping back into the little face like dawn coming up over a cold field, and the whole crowded cabin let out, as one body, a breath it had not known it was holding. The child lived. The kind-eyed woman sat back on her heels, all the way spent, her own face wet now in the firelight, and she gathered the warmed child up against her chest, and held it, and rocked it, slow, the way women have rocked children since the very beginning of the world. And the big man broke. There is no gentler word for what happened to him. The proud man, the hard man, the man built like a piece of the everlasting land, knelt down on the floor of a dead fool's cabin, and wept like a child himself. His great shoulders heaved. His heavy, capable hands lay open and useless in his lap. "You knew how," he said to his wife. His voice came out in pieces. "All this time, you knew how, and I—" The words gave out under him. "You never once told me." She looked at him with a tenderness that had somehow outlived every cold year between them. "You wanted a quiet wife," she said gently. "So a quiet wife is what you got." She looked down at the small, warm life in her arms. But a person does not forget how to pull a soul back from the edge. It waits. It waits for the night it's needed. The big man bowed his head. And then, slowly, he turned. Not to his wife. To the boy by the door. The whole crowded cabin watched him do it. "I owe you a thing I can't ever pay," the big man said, and his voice was raw, clean down to the root. "You opened that door to me, after all of it." He pressed the heels of his hands hard against his eyes. "You opened it the way he would have." He did not need to say who he meant. Every soul in that room already knew. And then a proud man said the thing he had been running from for the better part of his whole life. The big man lowered his hands from his face. He looked slow around the crowded room, at the children gathered by the fire, at the families he had known the whole of his life, at the warm rooms holding strong and sure, while out beyond the walls his own fine house lay broken and buried under the snow. "There's a thing none of you know," he said. "A thing I've carried a long, long time, and let not one living soul lay eyes on." The room went still. "A long time ago," the big man said, "before most of you in here were even grown, there was a winter like this one, a killing winter." He nodded toward the old man from the diner, who sat very still and straight by the hearth. He remembers it well enough. He's got the scar on his arm to prove it. The old man said nothing at all. His pale eyes only held the big man's, steady as stone. "The houses came down that winter," the big man went on. "The proper houses. The ones built right. The ones built the way my own father taught me, with his own hands, and the way I have built every house since." He swallowed hard. "They folded up like wet paper, and a young man got himself caught out in the white, with his whole life still ahead of him, and not a roof left standing anywhere over his head." His voice dropped low, almost to nothing. "That young man was me," he said. A murmur moved through the room, soft as wind. "And the place that took me in," the big man said, "the place that kept me breathing while the cold did its level best to have me for good, was this one, this cabin, this crazy roof." He looked up, his eyes shining. "The boy nobody ever once came for is standing right there in the very room that saved my worthless life. And I have spent every winter since calling the man who built it a fool, and teaching a whole valley to laugh along with me." He looked up toward the dark beams overhead, though he could not see the names carved into them, did not yet even know they were there. "He handed me a hot cup that night," the big man said. "He pulled a blanket off his own bed and put it round my shoulders. He never once said he told me so. He treated a half-frozen stranger like his own blood. He shook his head slow, and I hated him for it. God help me, I hated him for every bit of it." The boy stood frozen by the door. "I hated him," the big man said, "because if that old man was right, then I was wrong. About all of it. Every house I ever raised, every roof I ever swore up and down was the proper way. My whole life's work, wrong, every board of it, from the very start." He pressed his lips together. Now, a man can forgive himself a great deal. But that, he could not. So I called the old man crazy, and I made sure the whole valley laughed when I did, and I told myself the laughing was the same thing as the truth. He turned back to the boy, and when he died, the big man said, and left it all to a boy that no one had ever come for. I tried to take it. I tried to buy the proof of my own foolishness away before it could finish making a fool of me in front of everyone I knew. He drew a long, shaking breath. "I am ashamed. There's no smaller way to lay it down. I am ashamed of myself all the way to the bone." The cabin was silent, but for the fire and the muffled roar of the storm still working at the walls. Caleb looked at the broken man kneeling there on his grandfather's worn floor. He could have said a great many things. He could have named every cruelty, one by one. He could have held up the cold welcome of the town and the empty shelves of the feed store, and the words, "This country wasn't built for soft hands," and made the big man eat every last one of them. He had every right in the world to do it. But high overhead, in the dark, a careful hand had carved a single instruction down into the bones of the house, where the weather could not reach it, and the years could not wear it away. Love him first. So he crossed the room. He knelt down in front of the big man, this mountain of a man brought all the way down to the floorboards, and he did the thing his grandfather would have done. The thing the old man had done on a killing night a long while back for this very same frightened soul, when that soul was young and proud and certain of everything. He did not offer his forgiveness in words. Words were too small a thing to carry it. He laid a hand on the big man's heaving shoulder. "He's not here to tell you himself," the boy said quietly. "So somebody else is going to have to." He held the big man's wet eyes with his own. "He'd have opened that door for you. Every time. He already did it once. And he never held it against you after. Not in all the long years. Not even when his own roof was the very thing keeping your laughter warm." The big man's face crumpled all over again. "How can you know that?" he asked. How could a boy know what that old man would have done? Caleb thought of the journals, the patient leaning hand, the vow set down in plain ink in a hard year, after his own son had robbed him and named him crazy and walked off down the mountain with the old man's whole life in his pocket. Love him first. Teach him second. Whatever it costs. Whatever walls they put up. Because he wrote it down, the boy said. He wrote down exactly what he would do if he ever got the chance. And then he climbed up onto this roof, alone, year after year, with a chisel in his hand, and he carved it into the wood right over our heads, so it would last past him, so somebody would find it someday and know. He looked up toward the dark. He built this whole place to keep people alive, the boy said. People he loved, people he'd never even met, and people who didn't deserve a single board of it. He looked back down at the big man. You happened to be all three of those at once. And his roof held for you anyway. It didn't ask which one you were. The big man could not answer him. He bowed his head, and the boy kept his hand there on the broad and shaking shoulder, and all around them the crowded cabin sat in a silence that had nothing of judgment left anywhere inside it. The fire burned. The kind-eyed woman rocked a small life back to warmth against her chest. And the storm, for all its fury, for all its terrible patience, for all the houses it had folded, and the lives it had reached for in the dark, could not get in. It screamed at the walls of a dead fool's cabin. And the dead fool's cabin, built on the knowing of people who had outlasted far worse in colder places longer ago than anyone could rightly say, held every last soul inside it through the longest night any of them had known. By the time the first thin gray light began to seep in through the edges of the storm, something in that crowded room had changed all the way down to its roots. They had come into it as strangers, as enemies, as a thin boy standing alone against a whole cold valley that had decided he did not belong to it. They were not those things anymore. They had become the very thing the old man had seen coming, somehow, from a long way off and a long time gone. The thing he had built 2 roofs to shelter, and carved a lost child's name into the dark to wait for, and spent his last lonely years trying to make a little room for in a hard world. They had become, at long and unlikely last, something like a family. And outside, far off, beyond the white roar that even now had not quite spent the worst of itself, the longest night any of them had ever known was finally, slowly, beginning to break. The storm did not end all at once. It let go the way a great fury lets go, slowly, and then all at once, and then slowly again. The wind fell first. It dropped from a scream to a moan to a long, exhausted sigh, and then to a silence so complete that the people inside the cabin lifted their heads, one by one, and looked toward the walls as though they did not quite trust them. Then the light came. It came thin and gray at the seams of the shutters, and then white, and then, after a while, gold. Real gold. The first honest sunlight the valley had seen in longer than any of them wanted to count. Caleb crossed the crowded room and laid his hand on the bolt. He paused there a moment, the way a person pauses before opening a door onto a thing they cannot unsee. Then he drew it back and pushed. The door swung out onto a world made new and terrible and beautiful all at once. The snow lay deep over everything. It had softened the whole valley into long white curves, swallowing fences and woodpiles and the hard edges of things. It lay heavy in the pines, bending the great dark branches low. It glittered in the new sun until it almost hurt to look at. And it had buried, the boy knew, more than fences. But the cabin stood. He stepped out onto the porch and turned and looked up at it, the way a person looks up at a thing they have come to love. Two roofs, one above the other, not a board out of its place, not a beam cracked. The steep outer face had shed its terrible burden through the long night, the way the old hand had promised it would, and the still air between the layers had done its silent, patient work, and the warm rooms below had held every last soul through the worst the high country could throw at them. Behind him, the others came out onto the porch, slow, blinking in the brightness. They did not speak at first. They stood there, the families and the old surveyor and the young couple with their child not yet born, and the old man from the diner, and the big man, and the kind-eyed woman with a small, warm life still bundled in her arms. And they looked up at the roof a dead fool had built. And they understood, all of them, in the bright and silent morning, exactly what it had done. It was the big man who finally spoke. His voice came out rough, scraped down to almost nothing. He built it right, he said, to no one, to the roof itself, to the memory of a man he had spent a lifetime laughing at. He built it right, and we built it wrong, and he was the only one with the grace to keep it to himself. The kind-eyed woman moved to his side. She did not say anything. She just slipped her free hand into his great rough one, and the big man's fingers closed around it, and he bowed his head, and a tear cut a clean line down through the frost still caught in his beard. The valley lay quiet and white before them, and the long night, at last, was over. They left in pieces over the days that followed, as the roads opened and word spread that help was coming up from the lower country, but they did not leave the way they had come. They had come in the dark, as strangers, as the half-frozen and the desperate, scrambling toward the one light that had not gone out. They left in the light, slow, looking back over their shoulders at the small cabin in the high meadow as though it had become a kind of church. Each of them stopped on the way out to say a thing to the boy. The old surveyor took the boy's hand in both of his and held it a long moment and could not get a single word out, and in the end just nodded again and again and let his eyes say what his voice would not. The young couple named him a friend, plain and simple, and meant it. The families pressed what little they had into his hands: a loaf, a jar, a wool blanket, small things, the kind of small things that mean a great deal when they come from people who have just lost almost everything they own. And the old man from the diner was the last of them to go. He stood on the sagging porch a while, leaning on a stick, looking up at the two roofs in the morning light, his pale eyes wet. He'd have liked this, the old man said at last. The old fool. He'd have liked seeing his roof full of the very folks who laughed at it. He shook his head, slow. He waited his whole long life for somebody to understand, and he had to die and leave it to a boy he never met, for the understanding to finally come. He turned to the boy. "You did him proud, son," the old man said. "You opened that door." He squeezed the boy's shoulder with a grip stronger than it had any right to be. "That's the whole of it, right there. Everything he ever tried to teach this valley. You opened the door." And then he went, slow, down the white road, leaning on his stick, a small dark figure against all that brightness. Caleb stood on the porch and watched him go. And for the first time since the storm broke, he was alone again with the cabin. He had thought the quiet would feel empty. It did not. It felt instead like the cabin had something left to say to him. Now that the crowd was gone and the danger had passed, and there was, at last, room enough to hear it, he went back inside. The fire had burned down low. The room held the warm, close smell of all the people who had crowded it through the long night, and under that the older smell of wood smoke and time that had been there since the first day. He knelt to build the fire back up, and that was when he noticed it. The old man had saved one last thing for the very end, a gift hidden where only a grandson would ever think to look. In the warm heart of the house, beneath the place a family gathers. One of the broad stones of the hearth sat a little proud of the others. He had walked past it 100 times, stepped on it, swept it, built 100 fires beside it. But now, in the quiet, with the firelight low and slanting, he saw what he had missed. The mortar around that one stone was newer than the rest, smoother, laid by a hand that had wanted it found, but not too easily. He worked his fingers into the seam. The stone lifted free, and underneath it, packed careful in a hollow lined with oilcloth against the damp, sat a box. It was small, plain, made of the same kind of wood as the cabin itself, joined at the corners with the same patient care the boy had come to know, like a voice. The old man had made it with his own hands. Caleb lifted it out and set it on the worn table and sat down before it, the way a person sits down before something they are not quite ready for. For a long moment, he only looked at it. Then he opened the lid. Inside lay a set of old tools, chisels mostly, their wooden handles worn dark and smooth by a lifetime of a single hand, their edges still keen, still cared for, still oiled against the rust. These were the tools, he understood at once, that had carved the words into the beams overhead, the tools that had built 2 roofs and 100 careful joints and a small wooden box to hold themselves. A whole life's work laid down in a box beneath the hearth, and resting on top of the tools, a folded letter. The paper was soft. The hand on the front was the careful, leaning hand the boy knew now better than any voice he had ever heard. He unfolded it slow, and he read the last thing his grandfather had to say to him. The letter was not long. It said that if these words had been found, then the worst was over, and the storms had come, and the roof had held, and a boy was sitting safe in the warm where a man had always meant for him to sit. It said that the cabin had never been built for the man who built it. Every board of it, every careful joint, the 2 roofs and the still air between them and the deep, sure knowing handed down from people who had lasted through worse in colder places longer ago than anyone could say. None of it had been for him. It had all been for the boy. For a grandson, a hard world kept handing back. For a child, a man had been told he was too old and too far and too alone to be trusted with. A child, a man had been forbidden again and again to bring home. And then the letter said a thing that stopped the boy's breath in his chest. It said that once, a long time ago, a man had not been able to bear the distance any longer, that he had traveled a great way, farther than his old bones wanted to carry him, just to stand at the edge of a far-off place where the boy was kept, just to lay eyes, one single time, on the grandson he was not allowed to hold. He had seen the boy from a distance, small, quick, alive. And then a hand had come down on his shoulder, and a voice had told him he had no right to be there, and he had been turned away before he could take one step closer. He had stood there at the edge of that far-off place, an old man with empty pockets and a full heart, and he had watched the boy from across an impossible distance. And then he had turned and gone home, alone, up the long road to a cabin built for a child he could not reach. Caleb's hands shook on the soft paper. All those years, he had believed that no one had ever come for him. And the truth, at the very last, was the hardest and the most beautiful thing of all. Someone had come, once, quietly, across a great distance, just to look, and had been sent away. The letter did not end in sorrow, though. That was the thing about the old man. Even here, even in his last words, even after a lifetime of doors shut in his face, he did not end in sorrow. The letter ended in a kind of blessing. It told the boy that whatever he had been told about himself in those long gray years, it had not been the truth of him. It told him that he had been wanted from before he could walk, that he had been carried in a man's heart through every single one of those days the boy had spent believing himself alone, that a man had loved him from a distance the whole of his life, and had built him a shelter for storms the boy could not yet see coming, and had left him a way to live, and a way to last, and a way to be the kind of person who opens the door. And the last lines of it he read aloud to the empty room, because they were too large to keep silent. The roof will hold. It was built to hold. And so were you. You were wanted. You were carried. You were never, for one single day of your life, alone. Caleb laid the letter down on the worn table. He laid his hand flat on top of it, the way he had laid his hand on the carved beam, the way he had laid his hand on the door in the storm. And in the quiet cabin, With the fire warm and the snow bright at the windows, and a dead man's tools in a box his own hands had opened, the boy wept. Not the way he had wept as a child, in the dark, where no one could hear. He wept the way a person weeps when a thing they had given up on turns out to have been true the whole time. He wept like a boy who had, at the very last, come home. Spring came slow to the high country. It came the way it comes to high places, stubborn, late. A long argument between the cold and the warm, fought out over weeks, with the cold giving up its ground one reluctant inch at a time. But it came. The snow softened and slumped and ran. The meadow showed through in dark wet patches that spread and joined. The first hard green spears pushed up through the matted grass. And one morning, Caleb woke to a sound he had not heard in months. Water running, birds arguing in the pines, the valley waking up, and down the road, the sound of hammers. The whole valley had a great deal of rebuilding to do that spring. So many roofs had come down in the long night. So many homes stood open to the sky, waiting on the warm weather and the work it would allow. But the rebuilding this time was different. He learned it first from the big man. He came up the muddy road one morning. The big man did, on foot, his great shoulders set, and he stood at the bottom of the meadow and looked up at the boy on the porch the way a man looks up at a thing he has decided to face. Then he climbed the slope, and he took off his hat, and he stood before the boy and said a thing that cost him more than the boy could rightly measure. "There's a roof down in the valley," the big man said. "A house I built, a long time back. Built it the proper way, the right way." His jaw worked, the way that came down on a man's family in the dark, and like to killed them. He turned his hat slow in his heavy hands. "I'm going to take it down," he said, "the whole roof, down to the beams, and I'm going to build it back the way the old man built this one." He looked up at the two roofs above the boy's head, "And I don't know how," he said simply. "That's the long and short of it. I built houses my whole life, and I don't know the first thing about building one that won't fall on the people I love." He met the boy's eyes, and there was no pride left anywhere in his. "Will you teach me, son? Will you teach me what your grandfather knew?" For a long moment, Caleb did not answer. He looked at the big man, the man who had called his grandfather a fool to the whole valley, the man who had tried to take this very land out from under him, the man who had knelt on the floor of this cabin in the depth of the storm and wept and confessed and been forgiven. And he thought of the journals. He thought of the patient hand that had set down, in plain ink, in a hard year, the vow of what a man would do if he ever got a second chance. Love him first. So he stepped back from the door, and he held it open. "Come inside," he said. "The journals are on the table." He almost smiled. There's a lot to learn. He'd have wanted somebody to learn it. And the big man came inside and bowed his head over the journals of the man he had wronged and began, at last, to learn the thing he should have learned a lifetime ago. It did not stay between the two of them for long. A thing like that gets around in a small place. By the time the first new roof was finished, the big man's roof, rebuilt the old way, board by careful board, with the boy at his side reading out the measurements. The whole valley had heard, and the whole valley had begun, slowly, to understand. Others came up the muddy road that spring, Men who had lost their roofs in the storm and wanted to know how to build one that would last. Men who had laughed along with the big man for years and could not quite meet the boy's eye, and came anyway because the cold had taught them a lesson that pride could not. Caleb taught them all. He spread the journals on the worn table and read out the knowing in the patient hand, and he climbed up onto the cabin roof and showed them the joints with his own hardened hands, the way the old man had shown him through the pages. And the children began to come too. They came trailing after their fathers at first, the way children do, but they stayed for the boy. He was not so very far from a child himself, after all, and he had a way of explaining a thing that made it feel less like a lesson and more like a secret being shared. He showed them the carved words on the beams. He told them whose hand had made them and why. One small boy, no higher than the table, stood a long while under those beams with his head tipped back. Then he turned and looked up at Caleb with a child's plain, enormous question. "Did he look like you?" the little boy asked the old man who made all this. And Caleb, who had no photograph, no memory, not one solid thing to hold of the grandfather who had loved him across an impossible distance, found he had an answer anyway. "I think," he said slowly, "he must have." He looked up at the words in the dark wood. "Because I'm starting to think a lot like him." The little boy seemed satisfied with that, and something in Caleb's chest that had been clenched tight since before he could remember eased open another quiet inch. The name of the man the whole valley had spent so long laughing at began. That spring, to be spoken a different way, not as the name of a fool, as the name of the man who had been right, the man who had kept the knowing when others let it go, the man whose roof had stood when all the proper roofs came down, and who had handed out coffee and blankets, and never once said he told them so. Caleb had set out in the depth of winter only to keep a promise to a man he would never meet. He had not meant to give the old man back his good name, but that, in the end, was what he did. And of all the things he did that spring, the smallest one was the one that changed him most. It happened on a bright morning near the end of the season. The work on the cabin was done. The roof was sound. The journals were copied out fair, so the knowing would last past him, the way it had lasted past the old man. The valley was full of the sound of hammers, and new roofs were rising all up and down it, each one built to breathe, each one built to hold. And that morning, he looked out at the leaning mailbox down at the turn of the road. The one the rain and the years had faded to a pale ghost. The one no hand had touched, the lawyer had said, in all the weeks before the boy first came up that road. He went down to it. He had a can of paint and a brush, and a board he had cut and planed himself, square and true, the way the old man's tools had taught his hands to do. He set the leaning post right. He tamped the earth around it firm. He hung the box level. And then, slow, careful, in the patient leaning hand he had taught himself by copying out the journals through the long winter nights, he painted the family name across the side of it, the name that had faded to nothing, the name a man had carried alone, up a long road, to a cabin built for a child he could not reach. He painted it back, bright and clear, where the whole valley could read it as they passed, and he stood there in the spring sun and looked at it. It was a small thing, a name on a box, the kind of thing most people never look at twice, But he stood there a long while, because for the first time in the whole of his life, there was a place in the world with his name on it, not a number on a narrow bed, not a file in a cabinet nobody opened, not a thing the world handed back, a name on a box, at the foot of a road that led up to a home that was his. The first letter came a few days later. Caleb found it when he walked down in the morning, the way he had taken to doing, just to see the name there, bright in the sun. The little metal flag on the side of the box was raised. His heart did a strange thing in his chest. He had stood at the bottom of so many roads in his life, watching for someone who did not come. He had waited as a small child for a family that stayed away. He had learned the hard way, the long arithmetic of hoping. And here, now, the small flag was raised. He opened the box with a hand that was not quite steady. Inside lay a single envelope, and on the front of it, in a hand he did not know, was written his name, not a number, not a label, not the cold words, recipient unknown that had been stamped, the lawyer said, across a man's whole life of trying. His name. He opened it standing right there at the foot of the road, in the spring sun, with the meadow green behind him, and the two roofs gray against the bright sky. It was a short note, a plain one. It was from a family down in the valley, one of the families that had crowded into the cabin on the worst night of the winter. The note thanked him, simple and direct, the way folks in a small place say a thing they mean. It said their roof was finished now, built the new way, the old way, the right way. It said the children asked after him, and it said at the end that they hoped he would come down for supper, any evening he liked, because he was one of theirs now, and a person who is one of yours should not eat alone. Caleb read it twice. Then he folded it, careful, along its crease, and he held it against his chest, the way he had once held a different letter, on a long bus in the dark, riding toward a place he could not picture, belonging to no one at all. He had carried that first letter like a shield. He held this one like a thing he had been waiting his whole life to receive. He looked up the green slope, at the cabin in the high meadow, at the two roofs the whole valley had laughed at the home a man had built, board by board, year by year, for a grandson he was never allowed to hold, so that the boy would have somewhere to belong when the world turned cold. And he understood, at last, the thing the old man had been trying to say all along. It was carved into the beams. It was written in the letter beneath the hearth. It was hung now on a mailbox at the foot of a road, in a name painted bright in the sun. You were wanted. You were carried. You were never, for one single day, alone. Caleb walked back up the slope toward the cabin. The sun was warm on his shoulders. The meadow was green and full of the small, busy sounds of spring. Down in the valley, the hammers rang out, raising roofs that would hold, on the knowing of a man whose name was spoken kindly now. And up ahead, the cabin waited. Two roofs, one above the other. A home with his name at the foot of the road, and a letter in his hand, and a whole valley below that had, against every cold thing it had ever told him, decided that he was one of its own. He climbed the porch steps. He stopped at the top, and he laid his hand on the door, the way he had laid it there on the first night, when he was a stranger to this place, and to himself, and to the simple, enormous fact of being loved. The wood was warm under his palm now. He looked up once toward the dark beams overhead, where a man's careful words kept their patient watch, and would keep it long after the boy himself was grown and gray and telling this story to children of his own. Then he opened the door and walked inside and was home.